past the last tilled field, an old pilgrim road runs off toward a ridge of black pines, and the grass has very nearly swallowed it. A village swears something horned and hungry is coming down that road, exactly as a long-dead seer foretold, and they want it in the ground before the prophecy can finish its sentence. Geralt has never trusted prophecy. He trusts the boot prints beneath it even less. Walk the waystones with him and keep count of who stands to profit from a thing that kills on schedule. The old pilgrim road began past the last cabbage plot, where the village fence had fallen inward and nobody had bothered to lift it again. Grass had swallowed the ruts, pale and high as a drowned man's hair, though the two lines of the road still showed beneath it, running between alder thickets toward a low ridge of black pines. No cart had come that way in years. Even the crows kept to the fields behind Geralt, hopping through the stubble, watching him go as though they understood exactly where the village ended and something else began. He stopped at the broken fence and looked back. The hamlet carried no name on any map he had seen. 20 houses leaned around a muddy square, roofs furred with moss, doors shut though the day was warm. Beside the well stood a little shrine of river stones patched with clay, and its wooden saint had lost both hands. From the eaves of the nearest cottage hung bunches of wormwood, rowan twigs, knotted cords, small bones drilled through the middle. Fear had gathered there piece by piece until the village wore it like winter clothing. 10 paces behind, the reeve waited, unwilling to come nearer the road. A broad man gone soft with age, beard gray beneath the chin and yellow around the mouth. He said Geralt had his coin. Geralt said he had half, and the reeve said the rest would come when he came back. Geralt turned his head, and the reeve swallowed and amended it. When the beast was dead, that was the bargain, Geralt agreed. Wind moved through the grass between them, carrying old rain and pig dung and something faintly sour off the road. The Witcher tasted the air, then shifted the baldric across his shoulder until both hilts sat easily behind him, and asked for the words again. The reeve glanced toward the houses. Faces vanished from 2 windows. "She spoke them at sunset," he muttered. "Old Nivara. 3 winters ago, when the fever took her. She had the sight from her mother's blood, folk said. Knew when lambs would come twisted. Knew which trees lightning would choose." Geralt repeated it, the words. The reeve rubbed a thumb over the wooden charm at his neck and gave them up. "When the sign is walked, the horned hunger shall wake. Along the marked road it shall come, drinking at the eye, breaking the wheel, bowing before the saint without a face. Before the cock cries, it shall cross the last stone and feed beneath our roofs." Geralt watched him and asked whether that was all. The man's eyes shifted before he said it was all they had heard. Asked if he had been there, the reeve said he had stood at the door, which meant it was not all, and Geralt told him so. The reeve's mouth tightened. For a moment fear gave way to anger, thin and mean. A dying woman raved. She bit through her tongue and clawed at the blankets. "What does it matter which word came first? It matters if you want me to follow them." No answer came to that. A shutter closed across the square with a dry clap. Geralt stepped away from the fence and crouched where the first grasses bent over the road. Under the green growth lay old wheel tracks hardened to stone, cut deep by generations of pilgrims walking toward some shrine long forgotten. Between the ruts, The earth had been disturbed more recently. A boot heel had pressed into damp soil after the last rain, the print narrow, the sole patched at its outer edge, pointing away from the village. Farther on, something dark marked a stalk of grass. Geralt touched it with 2 fingers. Blood, dried brown. Sheep or goat, perhaps. 2 days old. Behind him, the reeve said that nobody walked there. Someone did, Geralt said, and the man did not come closer to look. Geralt rose and followed the track 12 paces. It wandered along one rut, vanished where roots crossed the road, then showed again beside a low stone half buried in nettles, and there the blood was heavier. A hand's breadth of it poured over the earth and covered carelessly with leaves. A fly lifted from the stain and circled his wrist. Who was missing livestock, he asked. Everyone lost beasts, the reeve said. Who lost one 2 days ago? The reeve stared at the road as though it might answer on his behalf, then admitted Toman's black kid had vanished, the smallest of 3. No, they had found no carcass. Yes, there had been blood at the pen. Geralt wiped his fingers on the grass and observed that this had not seemed worth telling him. They had hired him for the creature on the road, the reeve said. You hired me because your fields are empty, your traps catch nothing, and 3 people have vanished. 4? The word came from the square. An old man stood near the well, bent over a hawthorn staff. He had slipped out of one of the houses while they spoke. A strip of white cloth covered his left eye. The other was dark and steady. The reeve swung round and told him to go inside, called him Varric, and Varric said again that 4 had vanished, that Mila was first. She ran away, the reeve said. With 1 shoe left beside the first stone, said Varric. The reeve's face reddened, and he repeated the order to get inside. Varric came no nearer the road, though he planted his staff at the fallen fence. You should tell him what Navara said before the prophecy. The part you cut away, because it named you. The reeve took 2 quick steps toward him. Geralt moved once, putting himself between them without drawing a sword, and the reeve halted so sharply that mud splashed his boots. Asked what she had said, Varric looked past him toward the road. She had said, "You have fed fear until fear has teeth." Then she named the signs. The square went quiet. A dog started barking behind a house, frantic and high, until someone kicked a door and shouted it down. Geralt watched the reeve's hands opening and closing at his sides. "Old poison," the man said. Nivara hated him. Why? Geralt asked, and learned that the reeve had had her son whipped for theft, that the boy was caught with grain. Varric struck his staff against the ground. Grain from his own tithe store, after the reeve's men took twice what was owed. Enough. The reeve's voice cracked across the square. 2 women drew children away from a doorway. Geralt let the quarrel hang a breath, then looked again at the narrow boot print and asked the son's name. Radek, said Varric. Where was he? The old man's single eye stayed on the pines. Gone since his mother died. The reeve spat into the mud and said gone before they could hang him. Geralt bent to the track once more. Narrow boot, patched outer sole. A man traveling lightly, setting his feet along the harder edge of the rut. It might have been Radek. It might have been any poor soul with worn leather and reason to keep clear of the square. Show me the first stone, he said, and nobody moved. He waited. At last, Varric lifted his staff and pointed down the road. Beyond the alder bend, 1/2 mile, carved with a split crown. What lived there? The old man's mouth worked before he managed it. Nothing now. The sour smell on the wind strengthened, and Geralt looked toward the line of trees and said that something did. He left the hamlet with the Reeve's unfinished protest behind him. The grass closed over his boots almost at once, reaching his thighs in places, hiding loose stones and rotted branches. But the old road ran straight enough underneath. On either side, the abandoned fields had gone wild with thistle and sorrel. Apple trees stood among the weeds, limbs bent under small hard fruit, and here and there the remains of pilgrim shelters showed above the nettles. A square of foundation stones, a scorched roof beam, the stump of a post once painted red. Nothing moved out there, and that troubled him more than movement would have. No mice rustling under the dry stalks, no larks lifting, no hair breaking cover ahead of him. He found a fox print once in a patch of mud, but rain had softened its edges until it belonged to another week. The road kept the silence close and carried it on between the alders. At the bend, he stopped. The air was colder there. Water dripped from leaves, though no rain had fallen since dawn, and a cluster of black flies swarmed low over the ditch, settling and rising in a restless knot. He drew the silver sword. The sound of the blade leaving its scabbard traveled farther than it should have, a slow metallic whisper among the trunks. His medallion stayed still at his throat. Geralt paid that little mind. Rot had its own signs: flies, silence, the greasy sweetness behind the sourness. A faint scraping came from beyond the bend, stone against stone. He kept to the outer edge of the road, setting each boot where the moss had not yet taken. Alders leaned close overhead, their roots drinking from a black ditch, and light came down through the leaves in narrow shafts that fell across old paving hidden under the grass. This stretch had been laid once with flat river stones. Most were sunk or split now. One stood upright ahead of him, taller than a man's knee, and he knew it for the first way stone before he was near enough to read the carving. A deep chisel line had cleft the crown down the middle, and lichen had crept into the cut. Beneath it, someone had wound fresh red thread around the stone 3 times. Geralt crouched, keeping his eyes on the trees while his hands worked. The thread had not seen rain. Its ends were cleanly severed. A dark stain marked the knot, and when he leaned close, the smell was goat blood. Behind the waystone, something scraped. Then came a wet, swallowing sound. He shifted left, and the ground sank beneath his boot. He threw himself sideways as the crust of leaves broke open. A hand burst up from the hollow below, gray-skinned and broad, nails black with grave soil, the fingers closing on empty air where his ankle had been. A second hand struck through beside it. The whole roadside tore open as the creature heaved itself out of a buried chamber, coming up hunched with its shoulders scraping stone, naked hide stretched tight over long bones and mottled with old bruises and patches of coarse white hair. Its head was narrow at the temples and swollen at the jaw, the mouth crowded with thick, flat teeth made for crushing. Torn burial cloth hung from one arm. A pilgrim's bronze badge dangled at its neck, green with age sunk into the flesh around it. A graveir. It blinked in the daylight with pale eyes watering and flung itself at him. Geralt met the rush obliquely, giving ground along the standing stones rather than back into the soft verge, and let the hooked hand pass before his chest. The second swing came low. He turned his hip, caught the forearm on his bracer, and cut across the ribs as it crowded him. Silver opened the hide with a hiss. The Graveyard shrieked and recoiled, more from the metal than from the wound, black blood running in ropes down its flank. It snatched a loose paving stone from the road and hurled it two-handed. Geralt ducked. The stone struck an alder and split bark from the trunk. Before the creature could reach for another, he stepped in and slashed at its knee. The graver sprang over the blade. For something so heavy it moved with ugly speed, folding itself in the air and landing on all fours, claws tearing furrows through the moss. Then it bounded sideways, not toward him, but toward the open pit it had risen from. He saw the trick a heartbeat before it vanished below. The chamber had another mouth. Geralt ran. Leaves burst behind him as the Graveyard came up from a second hollow on his right, and its hand caught the back of his jerkin and dragged him off balance. He struck the ground on one knee, sword arm extended, the creature's breath washing over his neck with the stench of opened tombs. Teeth snapped beside his ear. He drove his elbow backward into the swollen jaw, bone thudding against bone, and the Graveyard snarled and tightened its grip and began hauling him toward the pit where the paving had collapsed. From below came a softer sound. Small claws clicking in the dark. Young. He dropped his weight all at once, rolled beneath the clutching arm, and cut upward. The silver edge went through the wrist. The severed hand stayed tangled in the leather at his shoulder, while the creature reeled away, pumping black blood across the stone. Geralt tore the thing free and cast it aside. The graver charged again with its mouth open. This time he did not yield the road. He planted one boot against the base of the waystone and waited until the creature had committed its weight, shoulders high, wounded arm flailing, then stepped inside the reach, caught the remaining forearm against his chest, and drove the point up beneath the jaw. The blade entered to the crossguard. Teeth closed inches from his face. The eyes widened, clouded, emptied. For a breath it stayed upright, held between Geralt and the sword. Then the weight sagged forward and he turned with it and let the carcass strike the road. In the pit, the clicking stopped. He withdrew the blade and wiped it on the burial cloth hanging from the corpse. Black blood smoked faintly along the silver before sliding away. He listened to the hollow beneath the road, and a thin hiss answered him. Kneeling at the broken paving, he peered down into what had once been a pilgrim crypt, small and roughly mortared, built below the shelter beside the waystone. 3 stone shelves lined the walls, and the bones that had lain on them were dragged into a heap. At the rear, 2 young Graveers crouched over the opened belly of a goat, hairless and white as maggots, their eyes still sealed beneath gray skin. They smelled the air and began climbing. Geralt reached into his pouch for a small clay flask, pulled the waxed rag from its neck, struck flint to it, and waited until the oil caught with a low blue flame. The first whelp reached the rim. He dropped the flask into the crypt. Fire rolled through the chamber with a hollow breath. The young Graveers screamed below, claws scratching frantically at stone as the old burial cloth and dried hair and spilled fat took flame. Geralt dragged a cracked paving slab across the opening, then another, sealing the worst of the heat beneath the road. Smoke leaked between the stones. He stayed crouched beside the waystone for some while, listening until the movement below had ceased and the flames had settled to a dull roar. Somewhere far behind him a crow called, the first living sound since he had left the village. Then he examined the dead Graveer. The beast had fed well. Its belly was distended, and human hair clung between the teeth. Beside the crypt mouth lay bones stripped clean, some old enough to crumble at a touch, others pale and recent. Among them he found a woman's shoe, the leather cracked, a bronze buckle still fastened across the instep. Mila had not run away. Under the carcass lay a torn strip of sackcloth, darkened with blood. Geralt lifted it by one corner. Grain dust clung to the weave, and with it several coarse black hairs, too long for a goat. He held them to the light. They were stiff, hollow near the root, tipped with a reddish sheen, and they had not come from the graver. On the far side of the waystone, where the creature's passage had flattened the grass, he found a broad print pressed into the damp earth. 4 toes, heavy claws, the pad narrow for its size. It faced east, farther along the road, and beside it lay another line of goat blood poured in a deliberate trail. Geralt looked back toward the hamlet, hidden now beyond the alder bend. The prophecy had promised a beast at the first sign. The villagers had feared the stone and left the road untouched, and in their absence, a graver had opened the pilgrim's crypt and fattened beneath their silence. Someone else had come later. Someone with red thread, a butchered kid, and knowledge of the old words. He cleaned his sword, returned it to the scabbard, and stepped over the dead creature. Beyond the split crown, the pilgrim road climbed toward the ridge, its stones showing through the grass like the bones of something long buried. He followed the blood east. The trail thinned as the road climbed. At first it marked every third stone, bright where the shade had kept it from drying. Higher up, only the taller grasses at the verge carried a dark touch. Whoever had laid it knew how little was needed. A beast with a keen nose would find the next drop before the last had faded and follow the path as a hound follows a wounded deer. Geralt moved beside the trail rather than over it, watching for the narrow boot print that had left the village. The ridge rose gradually, though the old pilgrims had cut the road straight across it. Oaks replaced the alders, and their roots had lifted the paving into ridges and hollows until the way looked as though something buried beneath it had turned uneasily in its sleep. Pieces of old devotion remained among the trunks, strips of faded cloth tied too high for any living hand to have placed them recently, a rusted bell hanging silent from a branch, a stone bowl filled with rainwater and beetle husks. The black hairs from the first mark stayed wrapped in a scrap of linen inside his pouch. No common forest beast had shed them. The shafts were hollow, the tips reddish, which spoke of a creature bred for colder uplands, and yet the road ran east into gentler country. He had pulled similar hair from the thorn hedges of Kovir once, after a manicore came through, though those strands had been longer and barbed near the end. This might be younger growth off an old coat. It might be something else entirely. He trusted the print more than the hair. 4 toes, deep 4 claws, the weight carried long through the pad. The thing walked heavily when it chose to walk at all. Ahead, water sounded over stone. The road dipped from the ridge into a hollow where pale willows leaned together and showed silver undersides to the wind. A spring rose there beneath a shelf of rock and crossed the pilgrim way in a narrow channel. Someone had built a basin around it long ago. The basin held, though the carved rim had split and the water spilled through the crack into the reeds below. Beside the spring stood a second waystone. An eye had been cut into its face, long lashed and deep. A groove running from the lower lid down to the ground. Rain and centuries had softened the work, yet the eye lay open beneath its cloak of moss. Fresh red thread encircled the stone, the knot tied through a little bronze ring hammered into the groove, drinking at the eye. Geralt stopped above the hollow. The water smelled wrong, clear enough at the surface to show pale gravel, but a faint skin clung to the edges of the basin, green and oily, with dead midges riding on it. Nothing stirred among the reeds, no frogs. In the mud, deep furrows showed where something had dragged itself out of the spring and toward the road. He went down slowly, silver sword loose in his hand. The boot prints came up again beside the waystone. One heel slipped in the wet clay, so the patched outer edge showed plain. Near it lay half a sheep's liver, gray with flies, pinned under a flat stone, so the current could not carry it off. Teeth had torn at one side, narrow bites made by many small points. Geralt looked upstream. The spring issued from a cleft no wider than his shoulders, water pouring over black rock in a curtain thin enough to see darkness behind it. Willow roots gripped the bank on either side like knotted fingers, and the dragged furrows ran in beneath them. A bubble rose in the basin, then another. Geralt shifted a step back from the water, and a hand came through the surface and caught his boot. The fingers were blue-gray and swollen, webbed nearly to the nail, and they tightened with startling force. He drove the point of his sword down. The arm twisted aside and hauled him toward the basin while a second shape surged out from under the reeds. The first drowner broke water with its mouth open, weed hanging in strands from its skull, its eyes white beneath a film of river slime. A fishhook had grown into one cheek, the line trailing from it like a whisker. It pulled with both hands, working to drag him face first into the spring. The second came low from the bank. He let the first pull him half a pace, stamped his free boot against the stone rim, and turned with the force. The movement brought the second drowner across his front, and silver passed through its throat in one clean stroke. The head struck the basin and rolled into the water. The body flailed on among the reeds. The drowner holding him hissed and opened its jaws. Geralt kicked it in the chest. It lost its grip and went under, leaving a churn of mud and weed behind. He backed onto the road, blade level, listening through the rush of the spring. Water moved under the roots to his left. He pivoted as the drowner burst out of the bank behind him, having crawled through some flooded burrow beneath the willow, and its claws raked across his shoulder, catching leather, but not flesh. He dropped under the next swipe, caught the creature's forearm with his free hand, and used its own lunge to throw it across the raised edge of the road. It landed on the old paving. For a heartbeat, it lay exposed in the open, slick body, convulsing as it tried to turn. Geralt stepped onto its spine and drove the sword down between the shoulder blades. The point struck stone beneath. The creature shuddered, clawed twice at the grass, went still. The spring resumed its quiet spilling. Geralt pulled the blade free and stood listening, but no third shape rose from the water. He crouched beside the dead drowner and went over its limbs. The forearms were ridged with old scars. One calf bore a ragged wound, edged in blackened flesh, as though a hooked claw had torn through and poison had entered afterward. The other body lay half in the reeds. He dragged it out onto the bank. That one had been bitten across the back. 4 deep punctures under the shoulder, too far apart for a wolf and too clean for the graveir. The skin swollen purple around them. A broken black spine, no longer than a finger joint, was still lodged in the wound. Geralt worked it loose with the point of his knife. It curved slightly and ended in a hollow base. He smelled it, then touched the tip to a scrap of raw liver, and the flesh darkened almost at once. Venom. A manticore's tail carried such spines, though most were longer. An old creature would sometimes shed the outer growths and regrow them small before winter. The drowner had survived the wound only because little poison had entered, or because cold water had slowed its blood. He wrapped the spine in with the hairs. Something moved behind the falling spring. Too deliberate for water, he raised the sword and went to the cleft. The curtain struck his face and chest, cold enough to numb the skin. Beyond it lay a shallow hollow under the rock. No true cave, only a place where the spring had eaten backward into the ridge. A man crouched there in a dark wool coat, soaked to the shoulders, a short knife held in both hands. His beard had grown unevenly, shaved recently along one cheek and left wild along the other. Water ran from his nose, his eyes fixed on Geralt with the blank terror of a trapped animal. Geralt told him to put it down. The man's grip only tightened, and he said that if the Witcher came nearer, he would open him. Geralt observed that he had tried feeding worse things than himself. The man's glance went to the water, then back to the silver blade. Geralt entered the hollow sideways, careful not to block all the light. The place smelled of wet wool and blood and fear. A leather sack rested behind the man, its mouth tied with red cord, and beside it lay 2 strips of raw meat and a small wooden cup stained dark inside. The knife came up higher, and the man said to stay where he was, so Geralt stopped within reach of the spring's light. Beneath the coat, the patched outer edge of the man's boot was plain to see. "Radek," Geralt said. The knife faltered. For a moment only the water spoke between them. Radek's face changed by degrees, fear giving way to calculation, then to something harder, and he asked who had given up the name. "Varric," Geralt told him. "Still alive then," Radek said, and Geralt said for now. Radek glanced toward the opening, measuring the distance, and asked after Borin. "The Reeve," Geralt said. Radek wanted to know whether the man still fattened himself while the village starved. Geralt let that pass and said instead that Radek had bled the goat along the road. Radek's eyes lowered to the silver sword. He had walked the signs, he said. He had fed the Graver, Geralt said. He had fed what lived there, Radek answered. It ate a woman before you brought it meat. A muscle moved in Radek's jaw. Mila should not have gone near the stone. She lost one shoe running, Geralt said. She mocked my mother, Radek said, the words coming quickly and then failing him. He looked away into the rock. They all mocked her until they needed to know whether frost would come. Then they stood at our door with bread in their hands and lies in their mouths. Geralt stepped closer, and Radek thrust the knife at him, with no skill behind it at all. Geralt turned his wrist, let the blade pass, caught the forearm, and twisted sharply until the fingers opened. The knife fell into the spring channel and vanished under the water. Radek drove his shoulder forward. Geralt shifted his weight and put him against the wall, and the rock struck the breath out of him. Before he could recover, Geralt pinned him there with one hand at the throat and asked where the blood led. Radek clawed at the Witcher's wrist. To the road, he said. Where, Geralt said. The marks. How many? Radek's face reddened. Geralt eased the pressure enough to let him breathe, and the answer came out in pieces. 5-5 before the last stone. When Geralt asked what came along them, a strange calm entered the man's eyes. What she saw. Geralt pushed him harder against the rock and told him to name it. Radek said she had no name. Geralt said he did. Radek only shook his head. So Geralt laid it out for him. The thing had come from the north after the first snow 3 years ago. It had wounded the drowners here and left hair beside the first stone. Radek had found the trail and begun laying meat. He knew it was already hunting near the road, and his mother had seen where it would pass, and he had decided to make certain. Radek stared at him through all of it. A bitter smile touched his mouth at the end. She said the signs would be walked. She did not say by whom. She said the horned hunger would wake, perhaps because you woke it. The smile vanished. Spring water fell between them, and cold mist drifted through the hollow. Geralt released his throat and stepped back, and Radek stayed against the wall, coughing, rubbing at the red marks under his jaw. Asked why, the man looked toward the sack and said they had let her die alone. Fever does that. Borin barred the door, said she had cursed the village, said no one was to enter, no one was to bring water, no one was to hear more of her words. Radek's voice stayed low, though each word sharpened. I came at night. She was already cold. Her nails were broken from scratching the boards. Geralt watched the water bead on the man's coat. He said Radek wanted the beast to reach Borin, and Radek said he wanted the road finished, and when Geralt told him it would not stop at that house, Radek turned his head and repeated the words. She said it would feed beneath our roofs. Geralt offered that this could mean one roof. It could mean all, Radek said without hesitation, and the hollow felt smaller after it. Geralt bent, picked up the leather sack, and cut the red cord. Inside lay strips of mutton, wrapped in dock leaves, a clay flask filled with blood, and a bundle of carved wooden tokens. Each token bore one of the marks from the road: the split crown, the weeping eye, a bound hand, a broken wheel, a faceless saint. At the bottom lay a sixth carving, a gate with open jaws. Geralt held it up and asked where it was, and Radek looked at the token and said nothing, so Geralt crossed the hollow and seized the front of his coat. Where? The old toll arch, Radek said at last. Beyond the chapel, 1/2 mile from the first house. The next mark was the bound hand in the ashwood, and when Geralt asked what waited there, Radek's gaze shifted toward the sack before he answered. Men. Geralt released him and asked whose, and got Borin's name back. Not bandits. Collectors, Radek said, thieves with seals on their belts. The Reeves men had used the empty road then. A cursed way needed no guards, and travelers who ignored village warnings would vanish easily enough among the trees. Fear had hidden more than beasts. Geralt tied the sack closed and slung it across his shoulder, while Radek pushed away from the wall and said he could not stop it by leaving the marks unwalked. Geralt said he was walking them. The man's expression tightened at that. Then you are fulfilling her words. Geralt stepped through the falling water into daylight. Behind him, Radek said, Witcher. Geralt looked back. The man stood in the dark hollow, with the spring shining between them. She saw you, he said. White hair on the old road, a sword bright as frost. She said you would pass the eye and take nothing from the water. Geralt looked down at the venomous spine wrapped inside his pouch, then at the dead drowners on the bank. Seers, "Rarely see enough," he said, and climbed from the hollow and returned to the road. The red thread around the eye stone stirred in the wind. Beneath it, blood continued to seep from the pinned liver into the spring. A thin, dark ribbon carried eastward through the reeds. Geralt cut the thread, freed the meat, and cast it onto dry ground, where the scent would die under the sun. Rodek emerged from behind the water a moment later and refused the order to go back to the village, so Geralt told him to stay where he was. The man's eyes followed the road beyond the willows. He said Geralt did not know what was in the ashwood. Geralt said men. Rodek said they had bows. Geralt drew the steel sword. The blade caught the pale light under the trees. "So do they," he said, and walked on toward the third mark. The ashwood began where the road left the spring hollow and climbed between two banks of white stone. At first the trees stood scattered among hazel and thorn, their leaves pale beneath and dark above, turning with every breath of wind. Farther in, the trunks crowded close. Their roots knotted through the old paving, and long gray lichen hung from the branches like strips of weathered cloth. Someone had tied cords among them, hundreds over the years, some no thicker than hair, others braided from wool, horsehair, or bark. Each had once carried a prayer. Now they shifted soundlessly above the road. The third waystone waited beneath the largest ash. Its carving showed a hand bound at the wrist. Pilgrims had worn the fingers smooth with touching them as they passed, though the cord around the wrist remained sharp and deep. Fresh red thread wound through that groove, and a strip of sheep hide hung from the knot, raw side outward, its blood dried black at the edges. Geralt stopped before entering the shadow of the tree. Nothing moved among the cords. He lowered his gaze to the road. Rodek's boot marks continued along the left rut, clearer where damp leaves covered the stones, and other tracks crossed them. 3 men at least, perhaps 4. Heavy boots, one heel shod with iron, another sole carrying a row of square hobnails. They had moved from both sides of the road and then withdrawn into the wood. Geralt held the steel sword low and listened. The wind passed over the canopy. Leaves whispered. Somewhere deeper among the trees, a woodpecker struck 3 times and fell silent. Then a bowstring creaked, and Geralt stepped behind the waystone as the first arrow came through the cords. It struck the ash trunk at shoulder height, quivering among the old prayers. A second glanced from the stone and spun into the leaves. "Leave the purse and the swords," a man called from the right, "then walk back the way you came." Geralt looked at the first arrow, goose-feather fletching, broad hunting head. The shaft had been scraped smooth, but not stained or marked. He asked whether Borin knew. They robbed his road and got silence, and then the sound of a man shifting somewhere ahead, leather rubbing against bark. Another voice came from the left, saying the Reeve knew what he paid them to know. Geralt crouched and picked up a fist-sized piece of broken paving. "4 of you," he said. No answer. 3 bows, he continued. 1 man behind the tree with the red fungus, and he has no arrow knocked. The man behind that tree moved at once. Geralt threw the stone. It struck the trunk hard enough to make him flinch into view, and for an instant his shoulder and bow arm showed through the hanging cords. Geralt crossed the road before the others loosed. 1 arrow passed behind him. Another tore through his sleeve without touching skin. He reached the trees on the right and drove into the cover before the bowman there could retreat. The man was young, narrow-faced, wrapped in a green cloak, stained with rain. He tried to bring the bow across his body like a staff. Geralt caught it near the middle, wrenched it downward, and struck him once with the pommel, and the bowman folded against the roots. A third arrow came between the trunks. Geralt turned the senseless man by the collar. The shaft buried itself in the green cloak beneath the shoulder, passing through cloth and flesh, and the bowman screamed awake. "Rusk!" someone shouted. Geralt released him and moved left. The archer who had shot his own companion stood half exposed near a fallen ash, staring at what he had done. He wore a boiled leather jerkin with a bronze seal hanging at the belt, the Reeves mark stamped upon it. Geralt closed the distance before the man could draw again. The archer dropped the bow and pulled a wood axe from his sash, then swung at Geralt's head with both hands. The blow carried strength and little craft. Geralt slipped beside it, struck the axe haft with the steel blade, and cut through the man's sleeve along the upper arm. Blood darkened the cloth. The man stumbled into the fallen trunk and tried to climb over it. Geralt seized the back of his jerkin and dragged him down. The axe vanished into the leaves. A boot caught Geralt's shin. He answered with the crossguard, driving it into the man's mouth, breaking teeth and ending the argument there. Branches snapped behind him. The fourth man had chosen a spear instead of a bow, and he came out from behind the red fungus tree with the weapon tucked beneath his arm, running hard through the cords, old prayers catching across his shoulders and tearing loose in his wake. He was broader than the others. A scar split one eyebrow, and his right boot carried an iron-shod heel. Geralt turned to meet him. The spear point drove at his belly, and he beat it aside with the flat of the sword. But the man shortened his grip and thrust again before the Witcher could step inside. The second strike glanced along his ribs and opened the leather coat in a narrow line. The spearman smiled at that. He bleed like anyone. Geralt watched his feet instead of his face. The iron-shod heel dug deep each time the man thrust, and the left leg carried the weight badly, perhaps from an old break. So he gave ground across the road, and the spearman followed, gaining confidence with every step. The next attack came high and turned low in the final instant. Geralt caught the shaft under his arm and let the point pass behind him. The man tried to wrench it free. Geralt stamped on the spearhead and the wood bowed between them, and before the spearman could let go, he kicked the weak knee. The joint folded. The man went down with a grunt, still clutching the shaft, and the sword pommel came down on the back of his head. He fell face first beside the bound hand stone. One archer left. The wood had gone still again, though the stillness had a different quality to it now. Men breathed behind trunks. One of the wounded whimpered among the roots, and another spat blood into the leaves. Above them, the prayer cords swung where the struggle had set them moving. Geralt walked back toward the road and saw the arrowhead appear between two ash trunks ahead of him, saw the point before the bowman loosed. He raised his left hand. Ard struck the trees with a low crack, and leaves and cords burst outward as the hidden archer went backward out of his cover and hit the earth hard, his bow spinning away into the undergrowth. Geralt reached him while he was still trying to breathe. The man was older than the rest. His beard was clipped close, his left ear missing, and the same bronze seal hung at his belt. Geralt set the steel point against his throat and asked where Borin's toll was. The archer's eyes moved from the blade to the men lying among the trees, and he said it was not Borin's toll. Asked whose, he said nothing at all, so Geralt pressed until A bead of blood welled up beneath the point. "Travelers take this road despite the curse," he said. "You wait here. Those with coin are robbed. Those who resist vanish." The archer answered that they collected passage. Geralt told him there had been no lawful passage on this road in years, and the man said they had the seal, so Geralt cut the bronze token from his belt and held it in front of his face. Wax and soft metal, nothing more. The archer's mouth tightened, and he said, "Borin gave the orders." Asked where they took the bodies, he looked toward the waystone. Geralt followed the look. Behind the bound hand, the ground fell away into a shallow gully hidden by fern, the soil darker there than elsewhere, flies rising in small clouds from beneath a heap of ash branches. He took the sword point off the archer's throat and told him to show it. The man did not move, so Geralt caught him by the collar, hauled him upright, and walked him across the road. Beneath the branches lay a pit, long and narrow, its sides lined with old pilgrim stones pried up from the road. Lime covered most of what was inside, though the rain had washed parts of it away. Hands showed first. One wore 3 copper rings. Another still clutched a strip of rotted pack cloth. Deeper in, the skulls lay close together, some bare, some with hair clinging to them in wet ropes. The archer turned his face aside. Geralt asked how many. The man said he did not know. Told he had dug it, he allowed that he had dug some of it. Asked again, he gave a number. 12. Perhaps more. A groan came from the ash roots. Rusk, the young bowman, had rolled onto his side, and the arrow through his shoulder shifted with every breath he took. His face had gone gray. Geralt looked at the older archer and told him plainly that pulling it out would only make the bleeding faster, break the shaft, bind around it, carry him to the village. The man said they would be hanged. Geralt agreed that this was likely. The archer glanced toward the sword and observed that he could simply kill them here. Geralt said yes, let the words stand between them a moment, and turned away. At the third waystone, the strip of sheep hide swung from its red thread, blood drawing insects to it. Beneath the stone, half hidden by fallen leaves, Radek had left another of the carved tokens. The bound hand cut into one face, a crooked arrow scratched across the other. Geralt picked it up and turned it over. A mark for the men waiting here, perhaps, or a warning left by someone who knew the road better than they did. Radek had said men would wait. He might have watched the killings from among the trees. He might have learned where Borin buried those who vanished, and folded that knowledge into his mother's words until crime and omen ran along the same path. The older archer called after him, asking what waited farther on. Geralt turned. The man's confidence had gone out of him, and he was looking past the waystone toward the eastern edge of the ashwood, where the road narrowed between banks of fern. They did not walk beyond the wheel, he said. None of them did. Pressed for a reason, he described a horse found there last autumn, opened from throat to belly, its bones crushed, the saddle gone, though nobody had taken it. There had been claw marks on the stone, and something had dragged the carcass uphill. He pointed east when Geralt asked how far. Past the wood, a broken shrine cart near the cliffs. Geralt slipped the carved token into his pouch. Behind him, one of the wounded began cursing under his breath, and the spearman had woken and was trying to rise on his ruined knee. Rusk cried out as the older archer snapped the arrow shaft. The sound carried among the ash trees and mingled with the soft, Knock of wooden prayer tokens striking one another above the road, Geralt cut the bloodied sheep hide from the waystone. Its underside held a tuft of coarse black hair, the same reddish sheen at the tips. He crossed beyond the third mark and found the beast's spoor almost at once. A claw had scraped lichen from one paving stone. Another mark scored the trunk of an ash, higher than his own head. 4 parallel cuts sunk deep into living wood, and beneath them lay a spine like the one he had pulled from the drowner, though longer, stained with old blood. The manticore had come through the ash wood. It had ignored the men hiding beside the road, perhaps because it had fed already, perhaps because the meat trail led onward and promised easier prey. Above the claw marks, a severed prayer cord hung from the branch, its knot still tight around nothing. The prophecy's bound hand had not held the beast. It had only marked where men waited with bows. Geralt sheathed the steel sword and went east. Behind him the robbers began the slow work of lifting their wounded. Ahead the ash trees thinned, and sunlight spread across a stretch of open road, climbing toward broken white cliffs. Somewhere beyond them, stone cracked with a sound like distant thunder, and then came the beating of vast wings. Beyond the ashwood, the land opened beneath a high white sky. The pilgrim road crossed a slope of thin grass and broken chalk, climbing toward cliffs that rose from the earth like old teeth. Wind moved freely there and bent the grass in long dark bands. Far below, the ash trees spread across the hollow in a pale canopy, their prayer cords too small to see now. The wounded men had fallen silent behind him. Ahead, nothing stood between Geralt and the 4th mark, but open ground. The sound of wings did not come again. He walked with the silver sword drawn. At the foot of the cliffs, the road divided around a heap of shattered timber. A shrine cart had overturned there years before, wheels bound with iron, painted canopy collapsed beneath stone and weather. Pilgrims once dragged such carts from village to village, carrying carved saints, relic boxes, and bowls for offerings. This one lay on its side with the axle split, half buried under chalk fallen from above. A waystone leaned beside it, the carving a wheel broken through the hub, fresh red thread crossing its face in 4 tight turns, bright against the white dust. Beneath the thread, Radek had wedged a sheep's heart into the crack. Flies covered it. Geralt stopped where the road first entered the cliff's shadow. Hot stone, old feathers, carrion dried nearly to leather. That was the smell of the place. On the slope above the shrine cart, something had scraped broad hollows in the chalk, and tufts of dull green scale clung to the thorn bushes growing out of the rock. Not black hair. He crouched and studied the ground. The manticore's tracks crossed the road north to south, deep where it had landed, lighter where it climbed toward the cliffs, and over them lay another trail entirely. 3-toed feet, a long heel claw, a narrow tail dragged through the dust. The prince circled the heart several times without once approaching it. A slizzard. The beast had nested above the road before Radek ever came. It had found the bait and left it, disturbed perhaps by the stranger scent on it, and the manticore had passed later, following the blood, going uphill towards the same nesting ground. Geralt looked at the cliffs. A ledge ran across them 20 feet above the road, hidden in places by juniper, and bones lay among the roots, some white and old, others still holding strips of hide. A horse's skull rested near the edge, with one side crushed inward. Wind rushed over the ridge, Beneath the overturned cart, dust moved. Geralt stepped sideways and the broken shrine canopy exploded. A scaled body surged through the timbers, wings striking the ground, throwing chalk into the air. It came low rather than from above. It had hollowed a den beneath the wreck. The head was wedge-shaped, horned above the eyes, the jaws long enough to close around a man's chest. One wing dragged against the stones, torn along the outer edge, but the other opened wide and beat once with force enough to send pieces of painted wood spinning down the road. Geralt raised his sword as the jaws snapped. He struck across the snout, silver scoring scales without biting deep. The slizzard recoiled and swept its tail through the wreckage. He jumped the first strike. The return caught his legs in midair and threw him against the waystone, and the stone drove the breath out of him. The beast scrambled forward on all fours, the wounded wing folding badly beneath it, forcing the body sideways. Geralt rolled behind the shrine cart as claws raked the place where he had fallen. Timber cracked above his head. A painted saint's face, split from brow to chin, dropped into the dust beside him. The slizzard thrust its snout through the broken frame, and Geralt stabbed upward, the point entering beneath one nostril. The creature jerked back with a roar and tore the blade from his hand. Silver stayed lodged in the snout, the hilt striking the timbers as the beast thrashed. He crawled through the cart's shattered underframe while claws tore into it from the other side. The broken axle lay across his path. He forced himself beneath it, coat scraping stone, and came out near the rear wheel. The slizzard ripped the canopy apart. Its head swung toward him, blood running over the upper jaw and darkening the pale dust. The sword still hanging from its snout, too shallow to kill, deep enough to enrage it. Geralt rose and drew his steel blade. The weapon would do little against those scales, but the shrine cart's iron-bound wheel stood between them, still joined to half the axle. The slizzard charged, limping on the side of its ruined wing. Geralt cut the rope holding the wreck against the slope. For years the cart had rested there, pinned by its own broken frame. Freed, it shifted with a groan, the remaining wheel turning half a span before it stopped against a stone. The slizzard struck the cart head-on. Timber burst apart, and the impact dislodged the stone beneath the wheel. The cart rolled. It lurched across the slope, axle grinding, the iron rim gathering speed as it turned toward the drop beside the road. The slizzard tried to wrench itself free, but the jagged frame had caught beneath its wounded wing, wood and scale twisting together. Geralt ran beside it. The creature snapped at him, jaws closing near his shoulder. He ducked under the head and brought the steel sword down on the torn wing joint, and the blade cut through membrane and lodged against bone. The slizzard shrieked. Its weight shifted downhill. Cart and beast slid together across the chalk, struck the edge, and went over. The fall was not far enough to kill it. The slizzard hit a shelf below and crushed the shrine cart beneath its body, one wing beating against the cliff, the other hanging by a strip of flesh. Geralt stood above while the beast struggled to rise among splintered timber. The silver sword had fallen free during the descent and lay beside its foreleg. He sheathed the steel, climbed down using the juniper roots, and landed behind the creature's head. The slizzard heard him. It twisted with terrible speed, jaws opening despite the blood filling its nostril. He seized the silver hilt out of the dust as the creature lunged, drove the blade through the soft joint behind its jaw, and leaned his whole weight on it. Silver passed between the neck bones and went in deep. The lizard's head struck the rock beside him. Its body convulsed once, claws cutting furrows through the chalk, then settled across the remains of the card. For a time only the wind moved. Geralt drew the blade free and climbed back to the road. Slizzard blood ran along the pale stone in narrow branching lines, reached the broken wheel carving, and stained the red thread black. He sat against the waystone long enough to breathe without pain. His left side ached where the tail had thrown him, but when he pressed beneath the ribs, nothing shifted. Bruised, perhaps cracked, no bone had broken through. He drank a mouthful of water, rinsed chalk from his teeth, and rose. The heart remained in the stone. Geralt cut the thread and lifted it out. The flesh had been pierced by something finer than a knife. 3 holes crossed one side, each rimmed with a dark green stain. Manticore spines. The creature had struck the bait without eating it. A warning, perhaps, or an attempt to kill prey already dead. Manticores were cunning enough to test unfamiliar food, especially old ones that had survived hunters and poison. Beneath the heart lay a folded scrap of hide. Geralt opened it. A map had been scratched into the inner surface with charcoal, the road running east beneath 5 crude marks, the broken wheel near the cliffs, then a square shape with no roof, then a final arch drawn like open jaws. A line curved north from the road toward a cluster of hills, and beside that line Radek had written one word: Den. Geralt looked toward the cliffs. The manticore's tracks climbed to the ledge and crossed the nesting ground. Slizzard blood marked one stone above. A torn strip of scaled hide lay farther on. The 2 beasts had fought, and neither had finished the other. The slizzard's damaged wing bore deep punctures around the joint, several small black spines still standing out of the flesh. The manticore had driven it from the ledge. Geralt climbed. The path was no path at all, only cracks in the chalk and thorn roots strong enough to hold his weight. At the top, the nest spread beneath an overhang. Horse bones, deer antlers, and pieces of old harness mixed with shed scales, and the air thick with reptile musk. Manticore prints crossed the center, darkened with blood. The tracks led north along the ledge, away from the pilgrim road, toward the hills, marked on Radek's hide map. For perhaps 50 paces the beast had followed its own wounded course. Then the prince turned sharply, descended through a break in the cliff, and came back toward the road below. Geralt crouched at the turning place. There, pressed into a patch of soft chalk, lay Radek's narrow boot mark. He had climbed to the nest after laying the bait, found the wounded manticore's trail, and walked close enough to lay fresh blood across it. A dark smear marked the rock, with drops leading back down to the road. The beast had abandoned the path toward its den and followed. Geralt descended faster than he had climbed. At the bottom he found the blood trail continuing beyond the 4th mark. Radek had poured it along the eastern rut, heavier now, no longer sparing the flask, and the drops shone wet in the shadow. Recent? Geralt touched one, still warm from the sun. Radek had left the spring after him, taken some hidden path around the ashwood, and reached the broken wheel before the fight began. He might be less than an hour ahead. The road ran on between the cliffs and came out on a barren upland where nothing grew tall. A roofless chapel stood against the sky some way off, its bell frame empty, and the 5th waystone rose before it, like a small dark figure. Something lay in the road, between Geralt and the chapel. He came on with the silver blade ready. A mule had gone down on its side, harness still fastened, the belly untouched. 3 black spines stood out of its neck, and foam had crusted at the mouth. One eye was open still, clouded with venom. There was no rider anywhere near it. What Geralt found in the dust were sandal prints rather than boots. Pilgrims, 2 of them by the look of it, though no pilgrim had any business on a cursed road. Their tracks came out of the east and stopped at the mule. One set carried on into the grass, stumbling toward the chapel. The other ended beneath a wide shadow, burned into the dust. 4 claw marks dug deep on either side. Between them ran the blood trail Radek had laid, straight as a drawn line toward the faceless saint. Geralt stepped over the dead mule and followed. The chapel had been raised where the upland fell away toward the eastern valley, and only 3 walls of it were left. The roof had gone. Broken rafters lay buried among nettles and pale stone, and the bell frame stood empty above the western arch, wind passing through it with a low wooden moan. Pilgrims had rested here once before the final descent, washing dust from their feet, leaving candles beneath the saint carved into the far wall. The saint had no face. Weather had rubbed the features from the stone, or men had struck them away. The hands were still folded over a staff, but the head was a smooth oval, darkened by rain. The 5th waystone stood beneath it, carved with the same blank countenance, and a red thread crossed it from brow to chin. Blood marked the threshold. Geralt followed it inside. The drops were not from Radek's flask, too thick, too uneven, with smears where a wounded foot had slipped. The sandal prints went over the fallen rafters and vanished behind the remains of the altar, and a man was breathing back there, each breath ending in a small, wet catch. Geralt came round the stone table and found him propped against the wall, both hands clamped to his thigh. He wore the brown robe and rope belt of a wandering penitent, though mud and blood had darkened the cloth almost to black. One sandal was gone. 3 narrow wounds crossed the leg above the knee, the edges swelling green. The penitent saw the silver sword and tried to crawl away, and Geralt told him to stay still, and the man said it had taken Brother Ivan, his voice breaking on the name. Geralt knelt and cut the robe away from the wounds. No spine had stayed inside, but the flesh was stiffening around each puncture. He opened a pouch at his belt, crushed 2 leaves of celandine with a pinch of white powder, and mixed them with spirits in the hollow of his palm. The man recoiled at the smell and asked what it was. "Something that may keep your heart beating," Geralt said, and when the penitent caught at the word may, he pressed the paste into the wounds. The penitent screamed and struck the altar with the back of his head. His hands clawed at Geralt's sleeves and then went slack, and sweat broke across his face, shining beneath the dust. Told to breathe slowly, he tried. His teeth chattered despite the sun overhead. Geralt bound the leg tightly above the punctures, then cut each wound wider with the tip of his knife. Dark blood welled out, thick as syrup. He let it run until the color brightened, packed the cuts with more paste, and tied a strip of robe around them, and asked what had taken the man's brother. The penitent's eyes rolled toward the open sky. "A lion with wings," he said. Geralt asked about the face, whether it had a man's face, and the penitent shook his head and swore, "No, gods preserve him. No, a beast's head, horns along the brow, teeth like chisels." He swallowed and shuddered and said its tail opened like a black thorn bush. "A manticore, then." though the old carvings and the words of villages had given it whatever shape fear required. Asked where it had gone, the man pointed weakly toward the eastern wall. Through a gap in the masonry, the road could be seen descending in long turns toward the valley, and a dark line crossed the grass below, too distant to name. "It struck the mule first," the penitent said. "Ivan ran toward the chapel. I followed. The creature came down without sound. It took him from beside me. Carried him, yes. Which way he could not say. He had seen only the shadow." Geralt rose and went over the chapel floor. The manticore had come down inside the western arch. 4 claw marks gouging the flagstones where the moss had not covered them. The hind feet had struck near the threshold, the foreclaws reaching almost to the altar. A large beast, older than the first tracks had suggested, and strong enough to lift a grown man without gaining much height. Brother Ivan's blood led to the northern wall, and beyond it the drops crossed the nettles and were gone over the slope. Radek's trail went elsewhere. The poured blood ran through the chapel in a straight line, passed beneath the faceless saint, and carried on east along the pilgrim road. Whoever walked those marks had not paused to help the wounded men or altered his purpose by so much as a step. Geralt looked back at the penitent and asked whether he could stand. The man tried to rise, failed, and gripped the altar. "No. Stay in the shade," Geralt told him. "Do not drink more than a mouthful at a time. If your tongue goes numb, bite it." The penitent stared at him and asked whether he would come back. Geralt had already turned toward the saint and said perhaps. Behind the waystone, the wall carried rows of scratched names, prayers, and crude signs left by generations of travelers, most of them shallow and softened by age. One carving near the floor had been cut more deeply, then hidden beneath a slab set against the wall. Geralt pulled the slab away. Fresh marks showed in the dust behind it. Someone had moved the stone recently. He crouched and cleared away cobwebs with his glove. 5 figures had been carved into the wall: the split crown, the weeping eye, the bound hand, the broken wheel, and the faceless saint. A 6th stood below them, larger than the rest: the open gate. Words ran around the signs in a narrow spiral, some nearly gone where damp had eaten the stone, others still sharp beneath the later dust. Geralt sounded them under his breath. The dialect was old, though close enough to village speech. At the crown, the buried mouth feeds. At the eye, the drowned flee poison. At the hand, the bound men loose death. At the wheel, wing strikes wing. At the saint, the road takes the innocent. Beneath the open gate, one final line had been cut so deeply that the chisel had splintered the stone. The horned hunger follows the hand that feeds it. Geralt read the lines again. They were not Nivara's words. The stone was older than she had been, perhaps older than the hamlet itself. Pilgrims had known the dangers of this road long before a dying seer put names to them. Gravers in the burial shelters, drowners at the spring, robbers in the ashwood, flying beasts nesting in the cliffs. The old signs had marked places where a traveler needed caution, and time had worn warning into prophecy. Nivara had seen those signs walked again. She had seen a beast following blood. Geralt moved the slab farther aside. A smaller inscription lay beneath the first, recent and angular, cut with a knife deep enough to leave fresh white lines in the gray stone. She saw true. Below the words, another hand had written in charcoal, "She saw what you made." Geralt touched the charcoal, and it came away black on his glove, still fresh. Radek was not alone on the road. A sound came from the ruined choir, soft as cloth dragged over stone. Geralt turned. A woman stepped out from behind a fallen pillar with a crossbow, aimed at his chest, perhaps 40, sun-browned and lean, her hair cut short beneath a leather cap. A pilgrim badge hung at her throat, though the cloak she wore had been mended with strips of hunting hide. She said he had killed the Graveir. Geralt kept his hands away from both sword hilts and agreed that he had. The drowners too, yes. Borin's men were alive, and at that her mouth tightened. Pity? The crossbow did not lower. She gave her name as Mara when he asked it, and named herself Nivara's daughter. And Geralt looked toward the fresh charcoal and said she had written that. She had watched him carve the other words 3 nights ago. Why let him continue? Geralt asked. Mara's eyes flicked toward the road beyond the chapel. Because he would have done it with or without her, she said, and because she needed to know how far madness had taken him. Far enough to feed a manicore toward the village. He thinks he is proving her sight. He is guiding the beast. I know. Wind shifted through the roofless chapel, and beneath Mara's fingers, the crossbow string gave a faint creak. Geralt asked where the man was now. At the last arch, she told him. She had followed him until the creature took the pilgrim, then lost him among the gullies. When Geralt asked why she had not warned the hamlet, her face hardened. Borin would have barred the doors and called it another lie, she said. He did that when her mother spoke of the road. He did it when she begged him to clear the first crypt. He did it when she named the men hiding in the ashwood. Geralt asked whether she had truly named them. Mara said her mother had named everything, though never plainly enough for fools. He turned to the ancient carvings and said that the woman had been here. As a girl, Mara answered. She had walked the road before Borin forbade it, and after the fever came, she dreamed the signs, and the beast with them, a horned shadow moving from mark to mark, drawing nearer each time blood touched stone. Geralt asked if she had seen Radek. Mara lowered the crossbow a finger's breadth and said her mother had seen a hand pouring from a cup and had thought it was Borin because she hated him. Seers see shapes. Hatred gives them names. Mara looked away first. From behind the altar came a broken whisper about the road taking the innocent. The wounded penitent had heard them. Sweat had left his face pale, and his fingers trembled against the stone. Geralt crossed to him and checked the pulse at his throat. Too fast, though still strong enough. Mara lowered the crossbow and said she had a horse below the eastern slope. The man could ride if tied to the saddle. Geralt told her to take him back. To the village? She asked. Anywhere west of the road, he said. And him? Geralt pulled the manticore's spine from his pouch and held it beside the wounds in the penitent's leg. The venom was the same. He wrapped it again and looked through the open eastern wall, where the blood trail shone. In places the sunlight touched. He would walk the last mark. Mara set the crossbow against her shoulder and said, Radek would not turn aside because he asked it. Geralt said he was not going to ask twice. She told him Radek carried more blood, 2 goats worth perhaps, enough to draw the beast down the final slope. Then he is carrying what it wants, Geralt said, and Mara's expression changed. For the first time, fear reached past her anger. She said he thought it was hunting Radek now. Geralt stepped over the fallen stones and followed the trail out of the chapel, saying that it had learned the road from Radek's hand. Behind him, Mara began lifting the penitent, and the man groaned as she pulled his arm across her shoulders. Wind crossed the ruined chapel and stirred the red thread on the faceless stone until it snapped against the carving like a small whip. The road descended east between low hills. Far below, the last toll arch stood black against the valley, shaped by distance into an open mouth, and beyond it lay roofs, fields, and the narrow smoke of the hamlet. A figure moved on the road before the arch. Another shadow circled above him. Geralt left the road where it began to bend. The pilgrim way descended in broad turns across the hillside, easy for carts and exposed to anything above, so he cut straight through the grass instead, moving between folds in the ground, where rain had carved shallow channels through the chalk. The last arch stayed in sight below him, two black pillars joined by a cracked lintel. Beyond it, the road ran through abandoned fields toward the hamlet, close enough now that individual roofs showed among the trees. Radek walked beneath the circling shadow. He carried the leather blood flask in one hand and a bundle over his shoulder, and at every dozen paces he tipped the flask and let a dark stream fall across the stones. He no longer looked back toward the chapel. His face was raised to the sky. The manticore turned above him, flying unevenly, one wing beating lower than the other where the slizzard had wounded it. Blood darkened the fur beneath its breast and ran along one hind leg. Age showed in the creature's flight. The wings were broad but ragged at the trailing edges, several ribs of membrane patched with pale scars, and the horns curved from its brow close against the skull, dulled and chipped by years. Its tail hung behind in a long segmented arc, ending in a spread of black spines. The beast did not descend. It watched Radek walking the bloodline toward the arch, waiting for the open ground to narrow around him. Geralt crossed the slope faster. Loose chalk slid under his boots. Once he dropped to a hand, caught himself against a thorn root, and continued without slowing. The pain in his ribs sharpened with every breath, but the distance between Radek and the arch was closing more quickly than the distance between Geralt and the road. Below, Radek stopped, and the manticore banked. Its shadow passed over him, broad enough to cover the width of the pilgrim way. Radek lifted the flask as though making an offering. The creature's head turned, and even from the hillside, Geralt saw the mouth open. Radek! The man looked up the slope. Geralt pointed toward the ditch beside the road and told him to get down. Radek did not move. The manticore folded its wings and dropped with scarcely a sound. Four legs stretched toward the road, and Radek hurled the blood flask against the stones and threw himself aside at the final instant. The beast struck where he had stood. Claws shattered the flask, and blood burst across its chest and muzzle. It landed heavily, wounded, wing dragging, then swung its head toward Radek with a snarl deep enough to carry up the hill. Geralt reached the road at a run. Radek had fallen beside the ditch and was crawling backward through the grass, one hand empty, the other gripping a short hooked knife. The manticore advanced without haste. Blood from the broken flask covered its jaws, and it licked once across the stone, tasting the trail it had followed from the northern hills. Geralt drew silver, and the blade's sound turned the beast's head. Its face held little of a man. The eyes were forward set and yellow, intelligent in the narrow way of a hunting creature that had survived snares, arrows, and poisoned meat. Coarse black hair covered the cheeks and throat. The muzzle was short, armed with wide crushing teeth, and along the brow the horns gave it the shape of something crowned for an old and cruel rite. It studied Geralt. Then the tail snapped forward, and he saw the spines leave the fan. Geralt dropped behind the raised edge of the road. 3 struck the turf above him. A 4th rang from the silver blade as he turned it aside, and another passed close enough to tug at his hair before burying itself in the ditch bank behind Radek. The manticore sprang, its wounded wing opening for balance rather than flight. Geralt moved across the charge, cut beneath the foreleg, and felt silver bite through fur into muscle. The beast struck him with the side of its head before he could withdraw. Horn and bone caught his shoulder and sent him rolling through the grass. Radek scrambled to his feet and stood staring at the manticore. Geralt told him to run to the arch, then said it again, "Now," and Radek ran. The beast heard him and turned away from Geralt, following the familiar blood scent clinging to his coat and hands, and it bounded down the road despite the wound in its foreleg. Geralt rose and pursued. The manticore gained on Radek before they reached the first pillar. Its tail drew back, the spines opening again, and Geralt took the small leather pouch from his belt and cast it low across the stones. The pouch burst beneath the creature's forefeet. White dust rose around its head, and the manticore recoiled, sneezing and clawing at its muzzle as powdered celandine and chalk filled its nostrils. Radek stumbled through the arch and struck one pillar shoulder first. Geralt called to him to get inside. "There is no inside," Radek said. There had once been a toll house joined to the arch. Only the foundation remained, along with half a wall and a sunken pit where travelers had waited while carts were counted. Geralt had seen it from above, stone on 3 sides, the open road on the 4th, narrow enough to hinder the wings. He told Radek to get behind the wall, and Radek obeyed at last. Geralt reached the arch as the manticore cleared its eyes. The beast shook its head, spraying blood and white dust, then came after him with a roar. He passed beneath the lintel. Cracks split the old stone from end to end, and ivy roots had entered the joints. On the northern pillar, the final sign had been carved into the base, a gate whose 2 sides ended in jaws, their teeth meeting around the road. Fresh thread bound both pillars together at knee height. Geralt cut it as he passed, and the red cord dropped behind him. The manticore entered the arch. Its unhurt wing struck the northern pillar, throwing stone chips wide. The beast twisted through and lost speed for a heartbeat, and Geralt used it. He turned beneath the damaged wing and slashed upward along the ribs. The silver edge opened membrane from root to outer joint, and the wing collapsed. The manticore screamed and spun, tail smashing against the southern pillar. A cluster of spines struck the half wall. One passed through the stone gap and tore Radek's coat along the side, and Radek fell into the toll pit. Geralt stepped back as the beast faced him again. Both wings hung useless now, one ruined by the slizzard, the other opened by silver, and blood ran beneath them. The foreleg he had cut shook under its weight, but the road narrowed within the broken toll house, and the manticore filled it from wall to wall. There would be no more circling above. The beast lowered its head. Geralt shifted the sword into both hands. Behind the wall, Radek gasped that she had seen this, that she had seen the gate and the white-haired man beneath it, while the manticore's claws scraped stone. Geralt told him to be quiet, watching the shoulders, the tail, the weight gathering over the hind legs. Did she see which of us lived? Radek said nothing. The creature charged. Geralt waited until its horns entered reach, then stepped against the southern pillar rather than away. The manticore turned with him, jaws closing around the edge of his coat. Teeth tore leather. Its shoulder crushed him into stone, and pain flashed through the bruised ribs. He drove the silver blade downward. The point struck the base of the horn and glanced aside, and the beast jerked its head, wrenching him from the pillar. Geralt let go with one hand before the sword could be torn free, and struck the manticore across the eye with his bracer. The beast recoiled. He pulled the blade loose and retreated behind the half wall. The manticore followed, forcing its wounded body through the gap, chest rubbing stone on either side. The tail could no longer swing freely, though the spines opened and closed behind it like black fingers. That was when Geralt saw what the old arch offered. The lintel above the passage had shifted when the wing struck the pillar. A wedge of daylight showed along one end, and dust still sifted from the cracked joint. He backed into the sunken toll pit. Radek crouched there with one hand pressed to his torn coat, blood showing beneath his fingers. Asked whether he could stand, he said yes. Geralt told him to climb the wall when it came down, and Radek looked upward and asked what would come down. Geralt raised his left hand toward the damaged pillar. The manticore lunged into the pit. Ard struck the arch. The sign hit old stone with the force of a hammer blow, tearing ivy roots from the joints. The northern pillar shifted outward, and the lintel broke along the deepest crack. The manticore looked up. Half the arch fell. Stones struck its back and shoulders, driving it into the pit. The broken lintel pinned one wing and trapped the hindquarters beneath a mass of rubble. Dust filled the toll house until the road vanished. Geralt heard Radek climbing. He heard claws tearing at stone, and something heavy slammed against the fallen blocks. Then the manticore surged upward, and the lintel rolled from its back. Age and wounds had not spent all of its strength. It rose from the dust with blood streaming from its mouth, one horn broken near the root. The tail whipped over the rubble, and 3 spines flew toward the wall. Geralt seized Radek by the coat and dragged him down. The spines passed above them. One struck the remaining pillar. Another hit the leather bundle Radek had carried from the road, and it burst open as it fell into the pit, meat scattering across the stones. Goat flesh, dark with blood. More bait for the final path. The manticore smelled it. Its head swung from Geralt to the scattered meat, then to Radek's bloodied hands. And something like recognition moved behind the yellow eyes. The hand that had fed it stood close enough to take. Radek understood and froze against the wall. The beast climbed over the broken lintel. Geralt rose between them. The manticore struck with one forepaw. He caught the blow on the flat of the blade, but the force drove him to one knee. Claws slid along silver and hooked beneath the guard, and the sword tore from his hands and struck the far side of the pit. The beast opened its jaws. Geralt rolled beneath the wounded foreleg and came up beside its chest. His hand found the steel sword, though he left it sheathed. Steel would open flesh, but silver had already entered the beast's blood, and the killing stroke needed the right metal. The manticore turned after him. Radek moved first. He seized a fallen piece of the red thread, looped it around the bundle of meat, and flung the bait toward the eastern mouth of the pit. Flesh struck stone beyond the beast. The manticore looked. Geralt crossed the space in 2 strides, recovered the silver sword, and drove it deep behind the creature's foreleg. The blade entered the heart. The manticore reared, carrying him upward with it, claws tearing at the air. The tail struck the wall hard enough to split stone, then curled toward Geralt's back. He twisted the sword inside the wound. The beast fell before the spines could reach him. Its weight struck the road and shook dust from what remained of the arch, and Geralt went down beneath one shoulder, pulled his leg free, and rolled away as the tail made one final sweep across the stones. Silence came slowly. The manticore lay with its head pointed east, beyond the broken gate. Blood spread beneath its chest and filled the carved jaws at the base of the pillar. One yellow eye remained open, fixed upon the road it had followed. Geralt stood over it until the breath left the body. Radek sat against the wall, hands trembling. The cut along his side was shallow, made by stone or the passing spine, and he stared at the blood upon his fingers as though it belonged to another man. "She saw the beast reach the last stone," he said, and Geralt answered that it had. "She saw it feed beneath our roofs." Geralt cleaned the silver blade on the manticore's coarse mane, while Radek looked toward the hamlet beyond the fields and said that then it was not finished. A cry carried from the road behind them. Mara stood above the ruined arch with the crossbow in her hands. The wounded penitent was not with her. She descended carefully over the fallen blocks, her eyes moving from the dead manticore to her brother. Radek rose and said her name, and she struck him across the face. The sound carried through the broken toll house. He did not defend himself. She told him he had brought it home. He answered that he had walked what she saw. She said he had poured the blood. And when he began that, she said, Mara cut across him. Their mother had seen a hand feeding it, and he had given the hand his own name. Her voice shook. Radek looked at the manticore. Geralt sheathed the sword. From the eastern fields came the barking of dogs. Doors opened in the distant hamlet, small, dark shapes appearing between the houses. The villagers had heard the arch fall or the creature's last cry, and men were gathering near the broken fence with axes, forks, and spears. Borin stood among them, his broad shape plain even at that distance. Radek saw him. His hand moved toward the hooked knife at his belt, and Geralt caught the wrist before the blade cleared the sheath. The two men faced each other beside the dead beast. "Steel is for men," Geralt said. Radek's fingers tightened around the hilt. Geralt held the wrist until they loosened. Mara took the knife from her brother and cast it into the toll pit, then turned toward the approaching villagers. Borin came at their head, breathing hard from the walk, a wood axe resting across one shoulder. Behind him followed 6 men from the hamlet and old Varek with his hawthorn staff. None crossed the last stone. They stared at the manticore beneath the shattered arch. Borin found his voice first and said the prophecy was ended. Geralt looked at the dead creature, then at the blood trail running between the Reeve's boots and Radek's, and said, "No, now you hear the rest of it." Borin's axe slipped from his shoulder into both hands. The villagers spread behind him, leaving space between themselves and the dead manticore. None stepped beneath the ruined arch. Dust still sifted from the broken lintel, whitening the beast's black mane and settling over the blood pooled among the carved jaws. The smell of venom, hot fur, and opened flesh lay thick on the road. Borin asked what rest. Geralt looked past him. 2 of the men wore the Reeve's bronze seal at their belts. One had the same square hobnails as the tracks in the ash wood. Neither of them met his eyes. Geralt told them to start with the grave air. Beneath the first stone, said it had taken Mila and perhaps others. It said the crypt had been left open long enough for the thing to breed. Borin glanced toward Varric and claimed the village had known nothing of any crypt. The road wardens had, Geralt said, and Borin answered that they had no road wardens. Geralt tossed the bronze seal he had cut from the archer's belt. It struck the ground before Borin and rolled through the manticore's blood, and the Reeve watched it settle with his own mark, facing upward. Behind him, one of the sealed men shifted toward the fields. Geralt drew the steel sword, and the man stopped where he was. The men in the ashwood had carried those, Geralt said. They had collected passage from travelers, and 12 bodies lay in a lime pit beside the bound hand stone. A murmur moved through the villagers. Someone whispered a name, and another man lowered his pitchfork and stared at Borin. The Reeve did not look back at them. Robbers stamp false seals, he said. They knew where you kept grain. They knew which travelers carried coin. They knew no one from the hamlet would follow them onto the cursed road. Borin's face had gone pale beneath the red veins in his cheeks, and he said Geralt had been hired for a beast. Geralt said he had found one and nudged the manticore's horn with his boot, and added that the road led through everything feeding beneath their fear. Varric came forward until the toe of his staff touched the last stone. His one uncovered eye rested on the Reeve. Nivara had named his men, the old man said. Borin said she had raved at shadows. She named Jasko with the iron heel, Varric said. The broad spearman from the ashwood had worn an iron-shod boot, and Geralt watched the recognition pass through the villagers. One woman covered her mouth. A thin man with a grain fork spat into the dust. Borin raised the axe and said it proved nothing, and Mara lifted her crossbow. The villagers drew back from both weapons. Radek stayed beside the broken wall with one hand pressed to his wounded side, his eyes fixed on Borin, and he made no move toward the knife lying in the toll pit. Geralt stepped between the axe and the crossbow and told Mara to lower it. She said the Reeve had barred Nivara's door. He told her again to lower it. Her finger held the string latch a moment longer, then the bow's nose sank toward the road. Borin kept his axe up. This was Radek's doing, he said. 3 years gone and creeping back with blood and beasts, and his mother had cursed the village, and he had walked every word of it into their fields. Radek's mouth tightened. He said Borin had been meant to stand beneath the last stone, so the thing could tear through his house, the Reeve said, so he would know she saw true. Borin crossed the mark. He came under the broken arch with the axe raised high, and Geralt met the haft with his steel blade, the edge biting deep into ashwood. He turned his wrist, wrenched the weapon aside, and drove his shoulder into the Reeve's chest. Borin stumbled against the manticore's flank and nearly fell across its open jaws. The villagers surged forward a step and halted when Geralt's sword point settled beneath Borin's chin. The Reeve stared along the blade. "Another pace," Geralt said, "and the road takes a man after all." Borin let the axe fall. It struck the stones beside the beast. Radek laughed once, a dry sound with no mirth in it, and Mara turned on him. He had fed a graveir, she said. He had not known it had young. He had laid meat at the spring for the horned one, he said. He had brought it past 2 unarmed men. Radek looked toward the chapel hill and said he had not known pilgrims still walked here. But he had known the road led home. His face changed then, the certainty leaving it little by little. He looked east beyond the fields, where the first village roofs stood beneath thin lines of smoke. Dogs barked near the fallen fence. A child had climbed onto a woodpile to see above the grass until a woman pulled him down. Radek's bloodied hand closed over the torn side of his coat, and he said he had only walked the signs. Mara stepped close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The beast walked your blood. No one spoke after that. Wind moved through the shattered arch. The strip of red thread Geralt had cut from the pillars twisted around a stone and came loose, skittering down the road until it caught beneath the manticore's claws. Old Varric crossed the last mark and approached the carcass with small, careful steps, leaning hard upon his staff. The creature's remaining horn rose nearly to his chest. He touched the smooth end with 2 fingers, then looked at Geralt and asked whether it was dead. Geralt said it was. Varric asked if he was certain. Geralt bent, took the manticore by the mane, and turned its head. The yellow eyes stared without light, and blood no longer moved from the wound behind its foreleg. Varric nodded and said they should get it off the road. Borin looked at him in disbelief and asked if that was all he had to say. It was not, the old man said, and pointed his staff toward the ashwood hidden beyond the western ridge. They would also open the pit. Several villagers murmured agreement. The reeve stared at their faces and found none willing to hold his gaze. Even the men wearing his seals had edged away from him, and one unclasped the bronze token from his belt and dropped it. Borin saw the movement. They owed their roofs to him, he told them, their grain stores, their winter wood. He had kept order while that mad woman filled them with nightmares. A woman near the rear stepped forward, dark kerchief, no weapon in her hands. Her brother had taken this road 6 summers ago. Borin turned toward her. He went south to sell hides, she continued, and you said wolves had found him. Another voice rose to say a wife's cousin had vanished at the spring. And Brannick, someone else said, Pavel and his boy. Names followed one another across the road, slowly at first, then more quickly, each drawn from some old absence that had been given a beast, a marsh, or a runaway's name. Borin stood among them with white dust across his boots. Geralt sheathed the steel sword. The villagers closed around their reeve. No one struck him. They took his axe, bound his wrists with the red cord from the arch, and placed 2 men beside him. The cord had been meant to lead a monster from sign to sign. Now it cut into Borin's skin as they turned him west toward the ashwood. Varric looked at Radek and told him he was coming too. Mara's brother lifted his head and asked whether he meant to the pit. Varric said he knew the road. Radek glanced at Geralt, perhaps expecting refusal, perhaps hoping for it. Geralt cleaned the manticore's blood from his silver sword with a handful of dry grass and said he had walked it once carrying bait. Varric tapped the road with his staff. This time the old man said he would carry the dead. Radek looked toward the western hills, and at last he nodded. The villagers set to work beneath the arch. 2 brought ropes from the hamlet. Others cut long poles from the abandoned hedges. They bound the manticore's legs and strained together to drag the carcass from the road. Though even dead, it resisted them with its weight. Claws scraped across the old stones. The ruined wings spread behind it like torn black sails. Geralt took the front rope when 3 men could not move the shoulders, and they hauled the creature through the last mark and into the field beside the toll house, where it rolled onto one side and exposed the silver wound and the scars crossing its belly. An old spearhead lay buried beneath the fur near its ribs. 2 arrow shafts had broken under the skin long ago. The beast had crossed many roads before Radek taught it this one. Mara returned from the eastern slope leading a small dun horse. The wounded penitent lay tied across the saddle beneath a cloak, conscious but shivering, and when he saw the manticore in the grass, his hand rose weakly and made a sign over his chest. He asked after Brother Even. Geralt pointed toward the northern gully below the chapel where the road bends and told him to look for blood on the white stones. 2 villagers went at once with a blanket and spades. Mara handed Geralt the reins and said the man needed warmth. Geralt asked about the venom. His tongue was not numb, she said, and the swelling had slowed. Geralt touched the penitent's throat. The pulse remained fast, though steadier than before. Keep him awake until sunset, he told her. Mara nodded, and her gaze followed Radek as he joined those gathering ropes for the walk west. She asked whether they would hang him. Perhaps, Geralt said. She said he could stop them. Geralt looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment, then glanced away toward the dead beast and said, "That had been foolish." The reeve stood bound beside the last stone. Dust settled into the sweat on his face. He straightened when Geralt came near and said the other half of the payment was in his house, that Varric could open it. Geralt did not answer at once. Borin asked whether he would take coin after turning the village against him, and Geralt looked down instead at the blood filling the carved gate, watching it find the grooves. "I killed what you hired me to kill." Borin's mouth twisted. He said nothing more. The sun had begun to lower when they started west. Geralt walked first. Behind him came Varric, Radek, and the bound reeve. Then the villagers with their poles and rope and shovels. Others stayed to tend the penitent and search the gully. The manticore lay in the field beyond the arch, its horned head turned toward the road it would never finish. At the faceless St. Geralt paused, long enough to tear away the red thread. Wind came through the roofless chapel, and the blank stone watched without eyes. Farther on lay the broken wheel, stained now with slizzard blood, and past that the ash wood, where men would uncover the pit beneath the branches. The marks remained. Only the blood between them was ending. Geralt stepped onto the old pilgrim road and led the village back the way prophecy had come. Prophecy came true here, more or less, which is the cruelest thing a person could say about it. Geralt takes half his coin and none of the credit, and walks the whole village back down the road the way their fear first arrived. The waystones still stand along it, worn faceless by weather and hands. Only the blood between them has stopped.